Our next step in our project is to begin to apply shading. So what I've done is I've removed my 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with the printed copy that I had attached to the top, and I separated my strips. I'm keeping the strips of the areas that I drew because I need this information for shading, but the areas in which the image is already printed onto my paper, I get rid of those now. So to begin, we're going to shade with a 6H pencil. We're starting with our lightest pencil because we're going to establish some of our lighter values first. I'm still going to be using the circular shading technique. So even though I have an image here in which I have some fur texture, I'm going to start with smooth shading because my first initial steps in shading is to establish some value structures in my composition. So let's review some things about working with pencil. So I'm just using a extra sheet of paper here. This can be a sheet of paper out of your sketchbook. When we first began working with value and pencil, we discussed pressure. So one benefit of working with drawing pencils is that you do have that range. We looked at that chart that showed you a wide range of pencil values. We talked about H pencils and that they stand for a harder graphite, which means they have more clay mixed into the graphite clay mixture than a B pencil, which is softer. It has less clay, allowing for more graphite to break off onto the paper. When we talked about using pressure, one thing I stressed to you is that you wanted to practice shading light values. Now 6H is going to help you already because it's such a light pencil because of that extra clay within the mixture. Not as much graphite's going to want to break off onto the paper. It's going to already help you establish some very light values, but you still need to watch pressure. When we talked about the darkest pressure, the heaviest pressure to create the darkest values with our pencils, I cautioned you not to press so hard that you damage the paper. And when I talked to you about damaging the paper, I pointed out that if you have ever taken a pencil and just really pressed really hard, and you could start to see grooves, you could start to see the paper buckling, and usually on the back too, you'll notice that, see how we can see a little bit of a bubble there from my pencil pressing so hard. It's damaged the paper, it's stretched out the fibers, and that's something you don't want in your pencil drawing. Now with a 6H also, because it's such a hard lead, you can't feel this through the screen, but I can feel the grooves and the ridges from that pencil. And in fact, H pencils can even tear the paper with too much pressure. So when it comes to any type of pencil you're working with, when you're going for the darkest value, you want a moderate pressure without damaging the paper. So in comparison to what we've done with HB, I'd say the darkest value your 6H pencil can create is going to be somewhere close to the medium value range from an HB pencil. And even then, I don't really want to reach this level. Again, the purpose of having this full grade of pencils is to help you establish a good value structure. So when I start working with 6H, I want to use it to fill in a lot of my very light areas because I'm going to go on to another numbered pencil, one that's darker, to start filling in areas that are slightly darker than 6H. And once I'm done with those areas, then I'll move on to another pencil that is going to create darker values, and I'll fill in the darker values that the next pencil doesn't reach, and so forth until I reach through my full range of pencils that I'll have available. So right now it looks like we will be working with a 6H, a 2H, an HB, a 2B, and either a 4B or 6B. So those are the 5 pencils we are looking to work with. So 6H is going to be our lightest, HB is going to be our midtones, and 6B is going to be our darkest, and it's also the last thing you apply. Because the B range pencils are very dusty, they also smear easily. Not saying a 6H pencil can't smear, it just doesn't do so as much as a B pencil because you're not leaving a lot of graphite dust behind. So to start with my project in my 6H, I'm going to look for my lightest values in each section of my drawing. So this is where I need these strips of paper from the areas I drew in. So looking here, this is a pretty dark strip. My lightest areas are my whiskers and some background areas. Now, in a pencil drawing, when we're working with a printed image like this, very rarely are you going to actually find a pure white that's the same whiteness as the paper you're working on. And you can look at, you can test that by just even laying down the white of the copier paper down near your image. So it may not read as well on the camera here, but there is definitely a difference between this white and this lightest gray value on my image. So right now, looking at it, there's going to be very few or no places at all that actually have a pure white value. So I'm going to be working with some light gray values from my 6H pencil. So looking at my reference and having it close by as I shade, I'm going to use my smooth shading technique because right now I'm just filling in some of my lighter values. So my whisker here is a light gray, so I'm not pressing very hard with my 6H pencil. I'm just establishing some of my light gray values. And since I'm on white paper, it's going to look a little bit darker at first, but eventually we're going to be filling in around it some darker pencils. So when you first start this, because you're up against white, any pencil you apply is going to seem very dark. But we will balance this out by going through our range of values and creating some darker values. So I'm going to work on filling in some of my lighter spots on this section, and then we'll look at the next section. So it wasn't much that I filled in with my 6H pencil in this area. I do have some other lighter gray tones, but they're not as light as these other areas I filled in with the 6H. So these will be areas that when I move on to my 2H pencil, I will start filling in. So since I'm done with my 6H in this area, I'm going to move on to my next section. So I want to pull out my image reference for it. And this one has quite a lot of light gray values. So I'm going to be using a lot of 6H in this area. And since I'm drawing with a 6H and have light outlines, I'm going to avoid my dark area so I can still see where those are. So again, I'm going to first work with my circular shading technique. I'm not too worried about texture at the moment. Texture is going to come in as we start layering pencils on top. So right now I'm sticking to my lightest values, and I'm using that value to fill in my large chunks that have a lot of light value within them. So here in the ear, even though I have a couple different light grays, I'm going to fill in this whole section with my lighter and lightest gray value with my 6H, and then I can start coming in, and this is what's going to help start creating the texture with my next pencil to break up this bigger area into this lightest gray and this slightly darker gray. So again, circular shading technique. Okay, so in that area I had quite a few very light whisker hairs that I didn't go in with my lightest value here around them because I didn't want to lose those. My whiskers are lighter than the other fur around it. So I'm going to establish these values on the rest of that face when I start into my 2H pencil. So that is something else you want to be cautious about as you are shading, in that when you're dealing with something as fine as thin hairs like whiskers on a object like this, you don't want to muddy your lines. You want to make sure you can see where those whisker lines are, or those fine hair lines are. So since the values around them are a little bit darker, I'm going to wait with my darker pencil to fill in these lighter gray areas, and then eventually my black spots when I get into a darker pencil. Looking up here in the ear, I have some light gray here. So again, as I mentioned, I'm just going to fill in this whole section with my lightest gray, and then I'm going to come in with my next pencil once I'm done establishing my light grays on my entire image and start helping to bring out that texture. Now here where it's mainly dark, I am going to start coming in, and this is where I'm allowed a little bit of directional line, and that I'm going to carefully shade and sculpt and draw those hairs in. So, you know, anything you do with your pencil needs to be a purposeful motion. You don't just want to scribble things on here. So since there is some lighter hairs that overlap this darker area, I'm coming in and I'm carefully drawing those in with a nice light motion with my pencil. So this section is now established with some lighter values, and now I'm going to move on to my next section to fill in the light gray values of it. So once again, I need my image reference so I can closely observe where those light areas are. I'm now ready to start the shading in this area. So again, I'm working with my 6H pencil, and I'm going to shade in the light values I'm finding in this area. So again, you want to have the strip you're working from near your work area so you have it to observe. And again, circular shading technique, my lightest value. So now that I have a light layer in this section, I'm ready to move on to my next section. Now, being that I'm right-handed, that means I am most likely going to have part of my hand having to start to rest on areas I have already shaded. Now, even though this is a harder lead pencil, it can still smear. And one of the things you want to try to prevent as much as possible in a pencil drawing is the smudging and the smearing. So what you want to do is have an extra sheet of paper. This can be a scrap piece of drawing paper. It can be a piece of notebook paper. Any paper will do. And you want this piece of paper for the sole purpose of protecting your drawing. Now, what you do is you lay this piece of paper down onto the parts of your drawing you have pencil applied to. Then that way, when your hand is resting here and it's moving to shade, it's rubbing up against this piece of paper. It's not rubbing up against any of your pencil that you already have done and applied. And this will help reduce the chances of smudging in your project. So I'm going to start with and I just noticed I forgot a place over here in the background. So I need to get this gray shaded in. And now I'm ready to start this next section. So again, I'm still working with 6H. I'm going in and I am shading in my very lightest values. So again, I'm just going with my lightest values. So I know that there are some other lighter gray values in each of these sections that I have worked on, but I'm going for my lightest values. So Always double check, make sure you didn't miss anything. So like up here, I do see a couple of lighter spots that I can add some light gray to. And so I think in my section there, that's all I'm going to do with the 6H pencil. So that leaves me one more section in which I'm going to apply some value to. So once again, I am bringing the strip over so that I have it to look at. And just like my first one, it doesn't have too much that's going to go in with 6H. So this shouldn't take too much time. So that is the beginning steps of my project. Again, I'm just pulling out, filling in my lightest gray values. And in the next video, we'll start into the next pencil that is going to be a little bit darker. We're still staying in the H pencil range, and we'll be working with a 2H pencil next. When we start adding that next pencil, we'll talk a little bit more about how we create more texture as we start getting darker with our values.